All right. Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. The Attorney General is on his way, but we're going to get going right now, and he's going to speak when he gets here. So good afternoon, and welcome to the University of Minnesota Law School. My name is Sam Dugan, and I'm a third-year law student here and the president of the Environmental and Energy Law Society. Thank you for attending today's event, the legal and scientific case for recovering climate change damages in Minnesota from fossil fuel companies. Today's event is being live webcast on the internet and will be indefinitely available on the internet for viewership on YouTube. Following remarks from the Attorney General and panel discussion among distinguished attorneys and scientists, we're going to hold a reception in Auerbach Commons, which is directly above where we are right now, one floor. The Environmental and Energy Law Society has been working diligently for months to put this on. And I'd like to take just a quick moment to recognize the members, student members of EELS. Would you please stand for a second? Thank you. Thanks for your hard work. Thank you also to the University of Minnesota Law School, its tech staff, event staff, and law council. And we're especially thankful for our co-sponsors whose sustained efforts made this possible. Fresh Energy, the Center for Climate Integrity, and the Union for Concerned Scientists. Climate change is in the news every day. It's discussed in classrooms and boardrooms and political committees and in judicial chambers. It is discussed in this country and across the world, and its effects are here, and the vast weight of evidence shows that its effects are getting more severe. Earlier this year, the U.S. Department of Defense issued a declaration in an official report to the Secretary of Defense stating that the effects of a changing climate are a national security issue with potential impacts to Department of Defense missions, operational plans, and installations. Unfortunately, climate change has been politicized and facts are conflated with opinion. Both facts and opinion have been distorted by disinformation, and this has exacerbated climate change. There's a growing body of evidence that shows that the fossil fuel companies knew about climate change, its risks and harms before the rest of us. And that makes sense. The fossil fuel companies are enormously competitive, and particularly among the major players, to compete in the world's most powerful and sophisticated corporations, you need to know everything about your product and your industry and your market. So you can look into the future and predict trends and demands and risk, and knowledge is power. Fossil fuel companies were and still are enormously powerful and enormously knowledgeable. We're here today to discuss whether liability attaches to that knowledge and what they did with that knowledge. Whether fossil fuel companies are liable for damages because they knew their products caused climate change. But more than that, we're here to discuss a trickier issue. Even if liability could attach to the fossil fuel companies, is suing them for climate change related damages good public policy? And is it in the interest of Minnesotans? And if it is in our interest, then how do we do it? So today we are here to address these questions head on. And with that, I'm now pleased to introduce Professor Klass to the stage. Professor Klass is a faculty chair of the Environmental and Energy Law Society. She's also the faculty chair of the Environmental and Energy Law program at the University of Minnesota Law School. She teaches and writes in energy and tort law, among other areas, and her work is published in many of the nation's leading law journals. Professor Klass will introduce the rest of the speakers and moderate the discussion.
Thanks, Sam. And so what we'll do, since we're still waiting on the Attorney General, is we'll start with, he's here. All right, so we will, where is it? Right here. There we go. Great.
All right, it's my great privilege to introduce our first speaker. Minnesota Attorney General Ellison graduated from law school from this very institution, the University of Minnesota Law School. Before entering elected office, he served 16 years as an attorney specializing in civil rights and defense law, including 5 years as the executive director of the Legal Rights Center. Attorney General Ellison then served 4 years in the Minnesota House of Representatives. From 2007 to 2019, Attorney General Ellison represented Minnesota's 5th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he championed, among other things, consumer protections and environmental protections. In Congress, he founded the Congressional Antitrust Caucus and the Congressional Consumer Justice Caucus. Please give a warm welcome to Minnesota's 30th Attorney General, Keith Ellison.
Hey, everybody. How's it going? Sorry, I'm running a little behind, trying to solve too many problems at once. But I've been really looking forward to this gathering because I really consider climate action one of the most central, most important issues that any one person can take on, particularly when it comes to people in our profession, lawyers. And I think there's an important role for attorneys general to play. And so I want to commend you for having this particular forum. And I also want to thank you all for the work you've done before today and look forward to working with all of you into the future. I believe that attorneys general really are and should be defenders of democracy. It's a position that in a modern American political landscape is critical on a range of issues, including climate and environment, but also civil and human rights, immigration reform, labor law, housing, all these things attorneys general are pushing and fighting for. And one of the key roles that we do is we are a check against the federal government. Right now, I'd be hard pressed to count on my hand or two hands or even really any of our hands, how many cases that we have brought as attorneys general against the federal government on the issue of climate and environment, endangered species, and a whole range of things. The authority that we have we do have to take the action on behalf of the public, and it's something that attorneys general are doing and I think will be doing more and more, particularly given when the federal government is not stepping into the space that it should in protecting the environment and the public interest. I think it's also the case that the attorneys general, including our own right here in Minnesota, has a specific role and responsibility to protect public health. The Minnesota Attorney General's office is proud. We have a proud history. We had Humphrey versus Philip Morris, where we were the one state that went to trial in that case. All the other ones had settled. And attorneys in Minnesota, under the auspices of the Attorney General's office, created an environment where not only did we get a compensation for victims, but also got to the truth. Because one of the things that these big tobacco companies had been doing is having non-disclosure clauses. And we fought them and made sure that the world would know what the facts really were. And I wasn't around when that happened, but people whose shoulders we stand on did that. And I'm proud to try to carry on their legacy. Just today, we've been on the phone talking about, you might have guessed it, the opioid crisis. That's another important public health issue that we're fighting to make sure that the people of the state of Minnesota are not only compensated, but treated with fairness and respect and truth. And so that's kind of what we are and what we're doing. The issue of environmental protection and public health are top on our list. So it's important to also note here that that the climate crisis fits into both of these areas. It's both environmental and it is I believe, a public health challenge. Minnesota is warming faster than any other of the lower 48 states. We are not an outlier. People think of the coast, they think of Florida, they think of California, they think of Louisiana. But our climate is warming faster, and it shows. The boundary waters will transition from pine and oak to grassland. Heat, stress, poor air quality, asthma are affecting vulnerable communities. And I will note that vulnerable communities really are at particular peril when it comes to the climate crisis. We know that people least able to protect themselves from the crisis get hit the hardest. We all saw African-American people wading through the water in New Orleans as they were trying to escape, but it's not just that. It also has to do with major heat waves in Chicago, poor air quality, bad air days, and people without access to health care, people who can't afford it, all more vulnerable than they would be without this crisis. July 2019, like a few weeks ago, really, was the hottest month ever on planet Earth. September 2019 was the hottest September ever. And the World Bank estimates that 2 million people will be displaced from Central America by 2050 due to the factors related to climate change. So it's affecting, and implicates and involves everything, including migration, the healthcare system, everything. And we all have got to step forward and do something about it. About 91 billion in climate-related disasters in the US in 2018, and we need creative action. And one of the great benefits of us being together today is that we can put our heads together on what we're going to do. There's a lot of other statistics that I could cite, but at the end of the day, you know those statistics. That's probably what's driving you to this meeting today. What we need to do is do something about it and take the action. Now, Minnesota is taking action on climate right now, right as we speak. We have done a number of things that I want you to know about, including adding staff to help meet the crisis, including focusing on our attention, building relationships. We've had over 25 community meetings, some of which are about issues of the environment and climate. We have one, I think, tonight at UCare, which is in North Minneapolis. 6 p.m. we'll be getting together to talk about environmental justice there. But we're doing things on climate right now. Right now, Minnesota has joined with other states to challenge the EPA regarding the Clean Power Plan repeal. I'm very proud to let you know that we are on the forefront of that fight. The Clean Power Plan, the EPA under Obama made a finding that greenhouse gases endanger the public health and welfare, and opening the door to regulation under the Clean Air Act. Clean Power Plan was the first ever attempt to regulate greenhouse gases from the largest source, electricity generating plants. And in July, the EPA published a final rule that will repeal the Clean Power Plan and replace it with a much less effective rule, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. And under that rule, which they call ACE, analyses have shown that greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota will probably go up. But we're challenging it. Minnesota is one of many states that is suing right now to hold the federal government accountable over this rule. I believe it's arbitrary, capricious, and definitely not in the public interest. But we're also doing more than that. We're challenging on vehicle emission rollbacks. We know that we're not. Minnesota is suing the Trump administration for its attempt to rescind California's waiver under the Clean Air Act that allows it to have more stringent greenhouse gas emission standards than the federal government. Winning this lawsuit is key and very important to allowing the Pollution Control Agency to implement the low emissions vehicle rule that it announced just the other day. It'll be promulgating. Minnesota will be ready to adopt the low emissions vehicle and zero emission standards that California and 14 other states have adopted. We're in that fight, and we could use your advice and help. Not only that, we're challenging the efficiency standards rollback. There are several attempts to roll back the Obama-era efficiency standards for appliances that Minnesota is monitoring or has commented on. These rollbacks are incrementally undoing any progress on reducing emissions collectively and are setting us back years. We're suing them, we're challenging them. And we filed a amicus brief to the Ninth Circuit in support of damages case. And so we joined 9 other states that submitted the amicus brief in the Ninth Circuit in support of Oakland and San Francisco in order to defend the state's authority to adopt and enforce requirements of the state common law, including monetary remedies in cases involving fossil fuel producers, sellers. Other states are busy too. Attorney generals across the country are not sitting back and watching this happen. There's a damages lawsuit in Rhode Island. We're looking carefully at it. There's an investor fraud lawsuit regarding climate in New York, and there's a civil investigation ongoing in Massachusetts. State regulations involving vehicle emissions, cap and trade. The fact is that states all over the country are focused on this issue, and we have several groups. We have of attorneys general, and climate is always a critical issue. We want to know and be more creative about what we can do next to make sure that we stand up for the rights of people. Now, let me just wrap up by saying this to you. Climate is obviously an existential threat, but our political landscape prohibits us from taking the action that we need to take on climate. One thing that I would say to you that is, if you want to work on climate, spend some time working on democracy. Things like gerrymandering, suppression of the vote, things like discouraging participation and making people lose faith in our democracy and representative democracy are as much of a threat as the climate problem, because if we can't fix that problem, then we can't fix this problem. So this issue of democracy and engaging more people to participate and lend their voices, and us developing a group of elected officials who reflect the will of the people is critical to challenging and taking on this climate crisis. I think we need to look for allies everywhere. That's one of the reasons why I'm making sure that I'm going to spend time in North Minneapolis tonight working on this issue of not just climate, but just environmental justice generally. It's why we need to invigorate and rejuvenate and really fight for things that we built years ago, like the Blue-Green Alliance, critical nexus of labor and environmental actors. We cannot give up on these kind of institutions. These sort of institutions will help us solve the problem, because the people who don't want to take climate action will invariably argue and pit jobs versus breathing. And this is a false choice. And yet there are win-wins available for us all over. But we got to be willing to engage politically to make sure that we can benefit from these kind of connections. So I would just argue to my friends in the environmental movement, of which I consider myself very much one, that we cannot ignore the fact that people do need to make a living. This is a real problem, and that we've got to factor in how we can have a fair economy in which people can live with prosperity and dignity and live in an environment which is one that sustains human life. Both are in front of us. Both are certainly doable. The last thing I want to say is that every time you click on a podcast or whatever, you hear somebody who has some magic bullet solution for this problem. Oh, we'll just, sequester the carbon. They got this new thing we're going to do. Don't put your faith in that stuff. I'm not saying that it's not promising in some cases, but we need to actually revisit how we're living on this planet. Change some things that we do. Harness the resources that are renewable, but just thinking that there's some cool technological fix that'll allow us to keep on living the way that we're living is simply not going to be the answer. We're going to have to live more sustainably. But that doesn't mean that we won't have as joyous, filled lives. It'll just mean that we might not have as much stuff, but it will mean that, but it will give us time to live in a sustainable, healthy, and proper relationship with this planet that is mother to us all. So with that, thank you all for listening. Sorry I was late. I do have a good excuse I have a good reason, but not a good excuse. And thank the panel, and I look forward. I'm going to spend time and participate. And it's good to be back in this classroom. I spent 3 years right in this room, so it's good to be back. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Attorney General Ellison. Thank you. We're going to proceed and re-invite Professor Klass back to the stage and get this panel underway. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Attorney General Ellison. I'm now going to briefly introduce our speakers. And after I do that, I'll give you a sense of what we're going to do between now and about 5 o'clock. So our first speaker is going to be Vic Scher, who is a partner at the Scher Edling firm in San Francisco. And he and his partner represent most of the local and state governments that have brought these climate change damages suits. So he's going to give us a sense of where of the ins and outs of the litigation and where it's at right now. Then we will hear from Jay Drake Hamilton, who is the Science Policy Director at Fresh Energy, which is a wonderful clean energy nonprofit here in the Twin Cities. Following that, we'll hear from Steve Polasky, who's a Regents professor and Fesler-Lampert Professor of Ecological Environmental Economics at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Applied Economics. A very long title, but you should know that the Regents professors at the University of Minnesota are like the top of the top of the top of professors. So we all bow down to Steve on a daily basis. Then following Steve will be Gabe Champ, who's an assistant professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, who's also wonderful. And some of the students here know Gabe because Gabe and I have been involved in putting together this new West Bank Environmental and Energy Collaborative between the Humphrey School, the Law School, and the Public Policy School to bring the students who are interested at all those schools who are interested in environmental and energy together. Each of the speakers will speak for 10 minutes. Then we're going to have a broader discussion of the issues that I will moderate. And into that discussion, we'll bring 2 additional discussants who are up on the stage with our speakers. The first is Roberta Walburn of the Cerisi Conlon firm, and she was one of the principal attorneys that represented the state of Minnesota and Blue Cross Blue Shield in their groundbreaking lawsuit against the tobacco companies in the 1990s, which resulted in a more than $6 billion settlement paid to the plaintiffs. Our other discussant is Rachel Licker, a senior climate scientist with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So I will direct some questions to Roberta and to Rachel, as well as to our speakers during the Q&A portion of the program. I'll try to leave about 10 minutes at the end for audience questions. So if you have a question, please write it on a note card, and you should all have note cards in front of you. And there will be students milling around, and you can give your note card to one of the students. They will bring the questions up to me, and I will ask as many as I can before 5 o'clock. And then at 5 o'clock, we will go, as Sam said, upstairs for a very nice reception. So with that, I will turn it over to Vic.
Hello. Great. Thanks, Professor Klass. Thank you, Sam, and the Environmental Law Society. Thank you, General Ellison, for your comments. I think you are dead on about the important role that attorneys general around the country play in not just the climate change cases, but also in so many of these other pressing public issues. As a trial lawyer, I look for 3 things inside the courtroom and 1 thing outside the courtroom. So inside the courtroom, we look at how strong is the causation case. Can we link the defendant's conduct to the injury that the plaintiff has suffered? Second, we look at can we attribute the harmful conduct to particular defendants? And in the climate context, this means the first means, can we link fossil fuel emissions to climate-related impacts? On the second, what we're talking about is, can we link emissions to particular companies. And the third thing, the one that I'm going to talk about in my first 10 minutes, is there a narrative of culpability that will really drive a jury's engine? And then the fourth thing, which is outside the courtroom, because when you bring important lawsuits that have impact, the first thing that big companies do is they go to Congress and ask for immunity. So can you win in the court of public opinion as well as inside the courtroom? I am going to focus on the culpability story in these next 10 minutes, and I'm going to give you a very, very bird's eye view of what we know only from the public record. This is primarily the product of investigative journalists going to the University of Texas at Austin and going through the corporate archives of Exxon. And so this is all publicly available information. The story starts sometime in the mid-60s, maybe a little earlier by some accounts, but by 1965, a presidential commission had issued, this is in the Lyndon Johnson administration, had issued a report on restoring the quality of our environment that included a section on CO2 emissions from the burning of fossil fuels, and raised the prospect that by the year 2000, increase in CO2 will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that market changes in climate could occur. It's hard to think of a more clear marker of when fossil fuel companies that were responsible for providing the fossil fuels should have been on notice about the risks associated with continued profligate use of their products. And in fact, they did take notice. That year, the head of the American Petroleum Institute, which is the umbrella organization for oil and gas companies in this country and many international companies as well, gave a speech at the national meeting in which he summarized the findings of the government's report and noted that time is running out and that one of the most important predictions of the report is that continued use will result in marked changes in climate beyond local or even national efforts. And not surprisingly, this was a fairly responsible step that he took, that the API took next. They commissioned a study by a group called the Stanford Research Institute. I went to Stanford. SRI is not associated with the university, although it's located in Menlo Park, California, nearby. And in early 1968, the EPI got back a report from SRI that said, yes, what the government panel said is correct. Significant temperature changes are almost certain to occur by the year 2000, and these could bring about climatic change, including a rise in sea levels, warming of the oceans. There's no doubt that the potential damage to our environment could be severe. And then it highlighted an area of major uncertainty, which is what are we going to do to develop CO2 control emissions to bring the emissions under control. So that's 1968. Over the next couple of decades, and these are Exxon heavy documents because they came from Exxon's archives, but understand that the significance of the API documents is that under the way API works, documents that come in at the request of API or the committees are then redistributed to all of the membership. So we got the API document from Exxon's files, and it would have been, although we haven't had a chance yet to conduct discovery, in Shell's files and Chevron's files and ConocoPhillips files, et cetera, go on down the road. Now, over the next 20 years, what we have from Exxon's archives is a series of reports by Exxon scientists that were not down in the bowels of corporate headquarters, but rather went to the CEO, the COO, the CFO, and the board. And including this one from 1978, this went to the Exxon Corporate Management Committee, in which J.F. Black, the scientist, said there's general scientific agreement that we're influencing the global climate through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels, and man has a window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies. I've just been given the 5-minute sign, so I'm going to skip over the next 20 years of internal corporate documents, other documents from the API, including this one from 1984, in which they actually predicted the likely impacts of 1 degree centigrade rise by 2005, barely noticeable, to a 5-degree rise by 2067, globally catastrophic effects. ExxonMobil internally and other companies had graphs that showed that their predictions of both fossil fuel consumption and impacts were prescient. I mean, they were just amazingly dead on. This is from Shell. By the time global warming becomes detectable, it could be too late to take effective countermeasures to reduce the effects or even to stabilize the situation. This is from 1988. Now, 88, I'm going to jump ahead here. Except check out this one. This is also from a Shell report. The changes may be the greatest in recorded history. All of the actions will be costly and uncertain, but could be made acceptable. Now, this is something that you see common to the investigations and internal discussions, which is that the changes in the climate will impose enormous costs on communities and even on society generally. But the question they beg is, who is going to pay for it? Now, 1988 was a fork in the road pivotal year. It's the year that NASA scientist James Hansen testified that the anthropogenic origin of CO2 in the atmosphere had been unequivocally detected. There were 5 bipartisan bills on climate, 3 of them from Republicans, introduced in Congress. Then Vice President Bush said, I'll tackle the greenhouse effect with the White House effect when I'm president. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed. And this is where the companies who arguably had only been failing to disclose what they knew to that point made a deliberate decision to embark on a multi-decadal, multi-billion-dollar communication strategy to avoid regulation and avoid responsibility. This is an Exxon internal document from 1988 saying they're providing leadership through the API, emphasize the uncertainty in scientific conclusions, and urge a balanced scientific approach. Any of you who have read Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchants of Doubt, will recognize that this is a page from tobacco, from hole in the ozone layer, and other strategies frequently promulgated not only according to the same strategy, but frequently often by the same participating individuals. And they went on the offensive. ExxonMobil and the Global Climate Coalition, nice name, took out full-page ads in the New York Times, specifically seeking to sow uncertainty and doubt about the science. We don't know enough about the factors that contribute to increases in Earth's temperature to take actions. Who told you the Earth was warming? Chicken Little? Now, at the same time that they were doing this, their internal documents, this is from the Global Climate Coalition, were acknowledging that the scientific basis for the greenhouse effect and the potential impact of human emissions, greenhouse gases, is well established and cannot be denied. That's what they're saying internally. Externally, they're saying we don't know enough. This is from an API communications campaign document in 1998. Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand uncertainties in climate science. Unless climate change becomes a non-issue, there may be no moment when we can declare victory for our efforts. And at the same time that they were sowing uncertainty and doubt, they were protecting their own assets to the tune of billion-dollar investments in their own infrastructure. So raising the level of offshore oil platforms to deal with sea level rise, strengthening those platforms in order to withstand increased storm severity and frequency, and investing heavily in technology to access what they knew would be a melting Arctic. I'm going to stop there.
Good afternoon. I'm J. Drake Hamilton, and I'm here to focus your attention on the costs of these damages to Minnesota. Minnesota is already being impacted by a changing climate, and these changes are projected to both continue and accelerate. The magnitude of future impacts and expenditures needed to address the impacts depends on the extent to which policies eventually limit greenhouse gas emissions. However, there is no realistic emissions scenario under which climate does not continue to become warmer and wetter until at least the year 2050. The rate of warming in Minnesota is getting faster since 1960. Dew points have also risen, which contributes to both increased humidity and increased rainfall. Winter temperatures in Minnesota have been warming 13 times faster than summer temps. Since 1970, the average temperature increase per decade has been 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit for the period December through February, compared to 0.009 degrees Fahrenheit increase during the period June through July. The state DNR has high confidence that extreme summer temperatures will increase in severity, coverage, and duration. The DNR has high confidence that extreme winter cold will experience a continued rapid decline. Climate change presents growing challenges to human health and safety, quality of life, and rate of economic growth. The damages of these impacts are projected to increase. The state has already spent millions of dollars adapting to the impacts of climate change and will need to spend at least tens of millions of dollars more to adapt in the future. Climate change is an increasingly important factor in flood risk and damage. Statewide, Minnesota experienced a 42% increase in the heaviest rainfall events, the 1 in 100-year floods, between 1958 and 2016. These changes contribute to both more frequent and more damaging flooding. Winter and spring precipitation are important drivers of flood risk in the Midwest and are projected to increase by up to 30% by the end of the century. In line with this trend, Minnesota has experienced an increase in winter and spring flooding. Looking forward, heavy precipitation events will significantly increase in frequency at least through the year 2100. Minnesota counties have been battered by 4 1 in 1,000 year floods in just the last 15 years, in 2004, 2007, 2010, and 2012. In 2007, the state legislature provided $165 million in disaster relief after flash flooding hit southeastern Minnesota. In 2010, the legislature, in another special session, provided $80 million in disaster relief after flooding in the very same small part of the state. Again, in 2012, the legislature called a special session and provided $167 million in flood relief to Duluth and 15 counties, as well as 3 tribes after storms and epic flooding over the span of just 1 week in June of that year. The 1997 Red River of the North flood in Minnesota, North Dakota, and southern Manitoba was the most severe flood of that river since 1826. Damages for the region were estimated at $3.5 billion. In East Grand Forks, with a population of 9,000, just 8 homes out of 9,000 had no flood damage. The state of Minnesota and communities in Minnesota paid for portions of the damage relief not covered by federal disaster relief. Since 1987, the Minnesota Flood Hazard Mitigation Grant Assistance Program has appropriated $510 million of state funds to help local governments implement 365 flood risk reduction programs. And local governments also contribute to the cost of these projects. Minnesota has an aging transportation infrastructure that is further stressed by increases in heavy precipitation events and changes in the state's average annual precipitation. The expected continued increase in the frequency and severity of heavy events will affect access to roads, the viability of bridges, and the safety of pipelines. In addition, heavy rainstorms can result in the temporary closure of roadways and contribute to substantial economic disruptions. As just one example, faster water flow caused by extreme rains can erode the bases of bridges, a condition known as scour. Scour may leave bridges vulnerable to damage and failure during flooding by undermining bridge foundations. The Minnesota Department of Transportation allocated resources to address bridge scour. Through multiple efforts, those costs will increase due to climate change. The EPA estimates the annual cost of maintaining current levels of service on Midwestern bridges from scour damage from climate change at about $400 million per year in 2050. In addition, the EPA estimates that higher temperatures associated with unmitigated climate change would result in, by 2090, in the U.S. annual road maintenance costs increasing by over $6 billion in 2015 dollars each year. Most of these costs would be borne by states, and Minnesota would be responsible for most of those in-state costs. What about storm sewers, wastewater, and groundwater infrastructure? Increased average annual rainfall, particularly the increase in the severity of extreme precipitation events, will damage water and sewer systems. As a result, costs will increase for local and state authorities who fund operations and maintenance of these systems. Wastewater management costs will also increase. Increased flooding in floodplains will more frequently exceed wastewater infrastructure capacity, overwhelming and submerging wastewater infrastructure. Treatment systems and pumping stations will require upgrades to withstand future conditions. Metropolitan Council has already begun requiring resiliency analysis as part of major wastewater treatment plant permit reissuances. Inflow and infiltration, known to engineers as II, of groundwater and stormwater into the wastewater system can cause overflow of wastewater systems and discharge of untreated sewer into waterways. Increasing rain intensity can contribute to increased water flows and II challenges. The Met Council has been working to reduce II by stormwater and groundwater, but between 2007 and 2015, Council spent $205 million on improvements to regional interceptors to reduce II. They have seen success in reducing annual wastewater flow despite increases in rain events. There is uncertainty about the future costs of these investments because of climate change, but costs could increase dramatically. Increased air temperature and changes to the hydrologic cycle associated with climate change have resulted and will result in public health impacts for Minnesota. The state of Minnesota has incurred and will continue to incur expenses in planning, preparing for, and treating the public health impacts associated with climate change. Extreme heat can cause dangerous living conditions. Data from the Minnesota Department of Health show that between 2000 and 2011, Minnesota recorded over 1,000 hospitalizations, 8,000 emergency room visits, and nearly 40 deaths directly attributable to heat exposure. The Minnesota Department of Health is planning for the likelihood that more Minnesotans will seek emergency help on hotter days. The state of Minnesota, through the Minnesota Department of Health and local health agencies, has provided public education to vulnerable communities about central cooling centers where people could seek out relief, and has incurred costs educating the public about what to do in extreme heat. Warmer temperatures due to climate change are predicted to increase ground level ozone. Ground level ozone contributes to breathing problems. Climate change is also predicted to result in increased wildfires, an increase in length of the pollen season. This combination of heat, ozone, and high pollen are predicted to increase the number of asthma hospitalizations. Data from the Minnesota Department of Health shows 1 in 14 children and 1 in 13 adults now currently have asthma. An estimated 408,000 Minnesota asthmatics in 2016. In Minnesota in 2014, asthma cost an estimated $669.3 million, including direct medical expenses, as well as in lost workdays. There were 21,800 ER visits and 3,400 hospitalizations for asthma across Minnesota in 2014. In 2015, 61 Minnesotans died due to asthma. Prevention, monitoring, and reporting costs borne by the Department of Health and other government authorities associated with the spread of vector-borne diseases will also increase. State costs for mosquito abatement to control vector-borne diseases in Minnesota will also likely increase. Minnesota is undertaking extensive planning across state agencies, as well as funding research efforts to assess Minnesota's vulnerability to a broad range of climate change-related impacts, and to develop adaptation and resilience strategies. A last note, the state of Minnesota damages and harms associated with climate change includes, in addition to those previously described, costs associated to the forests of Minnesota, costs associated with damages to tourism and outdoor recreation, including mitigating climate-related stress to plant and animal species and ecological systems. The costs associated to agricultural yields, management and mitigation of crop diseases and pest crops, and costs of adapting to less fertile soils. The cost of responding, managing, and repairing damage to Minnesota fisheries, including local extinction of cool and cold water fish species and the spread of aquatic invasive species. And finally, the costs associated with the threats to indigenous communities from disruptions to their livelihoods, health, and cultural identity. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon. So my father was a law professor, but I haven't spent much time in the law school. But you were coming back remembering as a student, and I'm kind of remembering law school as a little boy wandering around telling my dad that it was time to leave to come home. So I want to do basically one thing, which is to take you through a logic chain going from emissions or use of fossil fuel to the monetary damages. So this is really, in a way, it's filling out the causation chain that Vic was talking about. So I have 10 minutes and I have like 5 big arrows. So I'm really glad that Jay also filled in one of the arrows. So I'm not going to talk about that one as much. But okay, so we're going to start with the production and consumption of fossil fuel. That is linked to emissions of greenhouse gases. That is linked to changes in the atmospheric composition, right? We have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That's linked to climate change. That's linked to impacts. So Jay was talking about a lot of the impacts of climate change in Minnesota. And then finally, we're going to change that into, if we're going to bring a liability case, we've got to talk about what the monetary damages are, right? Okay, so really I'm really doing like 5 arrows. That's what this talk is about. Okay, so let's start with the first arrow. This one's pretty straightforward. There's not much uncertainty. We know what the carbon content of fuel is, right? So if you burn in your car a gallon of gasoline, we know what the carbon content is of that. There's a little bit more complexity when you get to coal because it depends upon what kind of coal you have. But this is pretty straightforward. It's basically accounting, okay? And you can add up this accounting. You can figure out if you know how much coal was used and how much oil was used and so forth. And this is well known. So we know how much greenhouse gases have been emitted from energy use. It's also from cement making. But this is accounting that is well understood. Okay, so if you want to get to the cumulative emissions by a given firm, you want to know how much did they produce through time, and we multiply that by the carbon content of the fuel. Pretty straightforward. Now, there's a couple of things you want to do to adjust this. For example, not all oil goes into our engines, it gets burned. Some of it goes into petrochemicals, gets stored. So there's an adjustment that you want to make for figuring out sort of what of this is permanent and what of this goes into the atmosphere. And there are additional sources beyond just the oil that we burn, for example. So along with producing coal, there's methane that gets produced in coal beds. It sometimes gets vented. That's also a greenhouse gas. Okay, but that first arrow is pretty well understood. Let's go to the second arrow. So we've emitted greenhouse gases. They're going up into the atmosphere. In one sense, that's a 1-for-1, right? So a unit of greenhouse gases that's in the atmosphere, it is in the atmosphere, it globally mixes. There is a fairly, there's a lot of science that goes into understanding the carbon cycle. So what we emit, there's sort of like these little arrows on the left-hand side, the 5.3, and so forth. There are huge carbon fluxes that look like, don't these dominate? So there's exchange with the ocean, there's exchange with terrestrial ecosystems. There's large amounts of carbon going in and out. The problem, of course, is what we have done is those, without our emissions, those were largely in balance, right? The fluxes between the atmosphere and the ocean and so forth. We've disturbed that. We keep adding more, and it piles up in the atmosphere. Now, it doesn't stay there forever, but it does reside in the atmosphere for quite some time. And this is, some of you may have come across this, it's the Keeling curve. It's kind of the signature of what we have done to the atmosphere. This is showing rising CO2 levels through time. Okay, so again, not much doubt about this part. Okay, so now we get to, if we've changed the composition of the atmosphere, what does that mean for climate change, right? So the basic physics of this also are not in doubt. I mean, this was known well over 100 years ago, that if you put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it basically acts like a greenhouse, right? It keeps the radiation in instead of bouncing off into space. And so we know a lot. This is from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Platform Program on Climate Change, that we have increased this sort of radiative forcing. You want to think about it as how much heat do we keep in as opposed to radiating outward. So in 2011, we were far higher in terms of radiative forcing than we were earlier. And that radiative forcing, that's, it's basically is turning up the heat. So the IPCC also projects ahead. So how much we're going to warm depends upon what we do, how much we emit. So the panel on the right shows if we kind of go along as business as usual, right? We keep putting up carbon into the atmosphere at the rate that we're doing now, or continue to grow with economic growth. These are in centigrade, so like a 5 degrees centigrade increase, that's 9 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, these are huge changes. And as Jay mentioned earlier, and Keith mentioned as well, Minnesota is warming faster than average, right? Than kind of the average place on Earth. Even if we curtail, so if we meet Paris climate objectives, for example, we're more to the left-hand one. So that doesn't mean that climate change stops, but it's certainly a lot less severe than if we keep on our current path. Okay, so this is all in the science realm. There's not a whole lot of uncertainty about, there's uncertainty about exactly how bad climate change will be for any given level of amount of carbon that we put in the atmosphere, but we know the direction. Okay, so now let's talk about, we have climate change, and this is really, I'm picking up where Jay talked about. What are the impacts of this? So there's a lot. Now, elsewhere, we would be talking about sea level rise and coastal flooding. This is actually a picture of Miami on a sunny day. It's just a high tide. Increased severity of storms. We've certainly seen that over the last few years. Changes in precipitation pattern. That's something that's, if we talk about flooding in Minnesota, it's from changes in precipitation patterns. Impacts on human health, which Jay talked about. Impacts on ecosystems. So where species are and where their ranges are, that's gonna shift. And there's many, many others. I'll just give you one kind of poignant example. So this is from NOAA. This is showing the $1 billion storm weather-related disasters. Okay, and it doesn't take much of a trained eye to see the increase severity of these events, right? So we have more severe storms, we have more powerful hurricanes. Okay, and I fortunately, thank you, Jay, because I'm going to run out of time. Jay went through this, right? Here are Minnesota-specific damages, right? We don't have sea level rise, but we have a lot of other things that are going to impact upon Minnesota. Okay, now the last step. Go from these impacts to, if we're going to charge liability to companies, what is the dollar value of these damages? And this is frankly the place that's the hardest. So as an economist, it kind of pains me to say this, but this is the step that actually needs more work, frankly. Let me give you two approaches to trying to do this. So there's sort of a top-down approach. Using what are called integrated climate economy assessment models. And coming up, some of you may have heard of something called the social cost of carbon. Okay, so kind of using that approach. The other approach, which is probably more intuitive, is a bottom-up approach. Let's figure out, go back to that list of damages in Minnesota. Let's figure out, what are the flooding damages? What are the healthcare damages and so forth, and build it up from there. Okay, the top-down approach. Let me talk about that for just a minute because, as I say, it's a little bit less intuitive, I think. There's been a lot of work on the social cost of carbon. Now, what is that? The social cost of carbon is the damages per ton. So if I put up another ton of carbon into the atmosphere, that's going to lead to climate change, more intense climate change. It's going to lead to these impacts. What is the dollar value of those impacts? There's been a lot of work trying to ascertain that. The Obama administration put together an interagency working group that estimated the social cost of carbon. You can see the sort of $43 a ton, a range, large range depending upon what you assume about discount factors and other things. But one way of doing this, and frankly, this is kind of back of the envelope, is to say, well, let's apply the social cost of carbon to what do we think the portion of damages are to Minnesota, because the social cost of carbon is global. So you can see that calculation. So one could go this approach. Okay, there are large uncertainties in various levels of this, but let's look at the other one. So we actually could make a fair amount of progress. And Jay already talked to you about, here are damages associated with existing things, with flooding. We could figure out under healthcare, for example, what do we think of is the impacts in terms of quality adjusted life years for people. So through these various mechanisms of heat stress or asthma and so forth. So there are a number of things that we can actually do. There are some things, I'm going to end here, where it's very difficult, right? So changes to ecosystems, how valuable is that? Sense of place. So Keith Ellison mentioned that Northeast Minnesota is pine conifer forest now. It's not likely to be that in 50 years. What's that change worth? That's a very difficult thing to put into a dollar term, but that's a real impact on people. Okay, so I will leave it there. Again, this sort of chain from where the fossil fuel industry is all the way through to damages. So thank you.
Great. Thank you all for inviting me to speak here and for sticking around. I'm Gabe Champ, I'm a professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. And what I want to address now that you've heard from the other panelists, I want to address whether or not this approach to policy, and I think this is an approach to policy, is a good idea, and what some of the questions might be when thinking about fossil fuel liability versus some other approaches. Before doing so, I want to start with some disciplining and motivating facts. This is just some of the science that Steve's talked about. The Paris Agreement states a goal of 2 degrees Celsius temperature change with an aspiration to move to 1.5 degrees. And this is what the science says global emissions need to look like. Greenhouse gases are cumulative in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide has a half-life of 1,000 years. So from the perspective of decision-making of anyone in this room, that's essentially forever, right? And so from that perspective, these are the pathways for emissions, meaning emissions per year to meet 2 degrees in the blue line and 1.5 degrees in the purple line. And I think what's really disciplining and motivating about this figure is that 0 comes up real quickly. But that 0 emissions for 1.5 degrees is 2060, and then 0 emissions for 2 degrees is 2080, and after that it's negative. And we don't know how to do negative emissions, right? We don't know how to do that economically. And so this is really, I think, part of what's driving the urgency around this problem. I think I want to overlay this figure now with where emissions currently are and where they're headed. This is a assessment of the Paris Agreement pledges made by countries. The dark blue line bar at the top is the sort of business as usual. Below that in the light blue are what countries pledge to do beyond business as usual under the Paris Agreement. And that yellow band is 2 degrees and that green band is 1.5 degrees. This goes to 2030 and this goes to 2100, the exact same figures, showing the gap between what needs to be done and where we currently are headed. And so I think because of this, there's a lot of motivation now to grasp at all available levers that we have and to understand what those levers are. So I would say broadly characterizing where we've headed as the United States in terms of climate policy has been starting with the technocrats. Before there was a real political movement to do anything around climate change, I think there are a lot of so-called wonks in the room who decided that the most important thing was to address this problem on its terms. And its terms are globally mixing greenhouse gases. There's no difference in the damages that a place like Minnesota or any other place faces in terms of climate change that depends at all on where those emissions came from. Meaning that a lump of coal burned in Minnesota and a lump of coal burned in China have the exact same impacts on climate change in Minnesota. The other fact, greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere forever. The other fact that there are many different sources of greenhouse gases, and those sources have really different alternatives. Our alternatives for electricity are really different than our alternatives for transportation, are really different than agriculture. And those alternatives have really different costs. And because there are greenhouse gases coming from so many different sectors, that we need to think about strategies that are appropriate and that can take into account those differences in costs. And so that led to a lot of technocratic thinking around things like cap and trade or a carbon tax that really takes into account that structure to achieve carbon reductions at the lowest possible cost. But I think as urgency has grown around this problem, I think particularly communities and activists have looked for more tools. And I think part of those tools have been tools that look directly at the fossil fuel suppliers and emitters. And that's created a lot of debate. I think particularly amongst the technocrats who had been shaping the debate, there's a lot of concern that this is, the approach of going directly after fossil fuels is too reactionary, is not taking into account the real nature of the problem. And so I think, one of the example quotes, Keystone XL really brought out a lot of these differences. Keystone XL, a pipeline, was opposed by a lot of climate activists. The Natural Resource Defense Council said that Keystone would drive catastrophic climate change. I think Jim Hansen referred to this as a climate time bomb. But you had other groups like the Resources for the Future think tank, nonpartisan think tank, which said that the political energy spent on Keystone would be better directed at enacting a global warming policy, something like a carbon tax that would make carbon-intensive activities more costly across the country. So with that in mind and the urgency of the problem in mind, I want to walk through some of the policy options on the table. this is a simple 2x2 diagram that really oversimplifies the options that we have. And the way that this diagram simplifies our options for addressing climate change with policy are either one, restricting fossil fuels in the first row, or supporting substitutes in the bottom row. And either restricting fossil fuels or supporting substitutes can be done by addressing the supply side or addressing the demand side. So far, I would say the so-called serious people in the room have focused just on the white-colored boxes. These ideas of restricting fossil fuels, I think most prominently are seen through cap and trade and a carbon tax, which says fuels should be taxed or have a higher price based on their carbon content. Supportive demand side policies, things like directly subsidizing electric vehicles or mandating specific technologies to encourage substitutes, and also supporting substitutes on the supply side, things like tax credits or clean energy R&D. That's really what's shaped a lot of our policy. And it's been sort of left off the table that there could be restrictive supply side policies that go after fossil fuel subsidies. There was a famous G7 announcement in 2009 that's basically gone nowhere. We've also thought about fossil fuel infrastructure bans. And I would say that what we're talking about today mostly falls under the restrictive supply side options. So I've laid out here a set of considerations I think are really important to tackle with to understand whether or not this is a good idea for organizations that have a limited capacity, who have to choose their battles about where to spend their own capacity and resources to address climate change. So there's three main reasons here. The first reason is that restrictive supply side or restrictive fossil fuel policies can complement demand side policies. So we know that demand side policies like a carbon tax or cap and trade have a lot of weaknesses. You can look to California, which has a cap and trade system, to see some of those weaknesses. In particular, there's a weakness in so-called leakage. That means that California can impose a strict carbon tax or a cap and trade they've done through their AB 32 policy. That's because of the interconnected workings of energy markets made it such that the neighboring states can increase their emissions. Right? There's a real problem here that because oil is traded on a global market, electricity is traded on a multi-state grid, that one state could restrict its own consumption, and that just makes it easier for a neighboring state to increase their consumption. But by directly going after supply, these two policies could work in tandem. Carbon price and restricting supply can both work together to avoid leakage. The second big reason on here is lock-in. And this is a really important piece with fossil fuel infrastructure, is that once you build fossil fuel infrastructure, it then becomes really cheap to use, right? There are a lot of upfront costs. And one thing that we really should be worried about with climate change is the long atmospheric lifetime of emissions. I started with greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere forever, right? And so if we're locked into infrastructure that makes it really cheap to continue using fossil fuels, then what really matters is that upfront decision to build that infrastructure in the first place. And so as we think about that, well, supply side measures can really start to address this, holding fossil fuel companies liable so that it becomes more expensive to build further infrastructure could actually be economically efficient too. And so there is a potential to speak to the terms of the wonks on their criteria of economic efficiency to say that going after the supply side could be more efficient. But for me, what's most convincing, I think, are actually the politics of this. I really think that at the end of the day, this is fundamentally a political problem. I think Attorney General Ellison really made this clear that this is a fundamental political problem. There are many different reasons why. I think one is that it's a global free rider problem, that we're not going to solve this problem one state at a time, one person at a time. It really is a global problem. And politically, there are, I think, 4 attributes of directly going after fossil fuel companies that make this a really important domain to explore further. First is that I think we have seen empirically it is easier to organize people to go out and oppose infrastructure. And we've seen that both on the renewable side and on the fossil fuel side, that when there is a clear project, it's very easy to mobilize people. I think second is this notion of policy sequencing, that we're going to need a lot of policies to address climate change. It's a pervasive problem. We're going to need to get to eventually a portfolio of policies that address agriculture, industry, transportation, electricity, and not just those 4 sectors, but within those sectors, many different attributes of that. And so policy sequencing is important. We need to get people to pay attention to this problem before we can go out and do the next policy. And so if we can organize around this policy, then that may make sense as a first step. Third, I think, is an interesting point that If we think about political coalitions that oppose climate policy, fossil fuels acting together are really hard opponents to overcome. We can look at lobbying dollars that are spent by dividing fossil fuel companies. Maybe there's a potential to have a winning strategy here. I think going after specific companies may be one way to do that. And then finally, on international cooperation, I think that, again, that this is a global problem. We need to be thinking about this from a global perspective. And one of the biggest barriers at the international level is that developed countries have not demonstrated that they're willing to take on historic responsibility. And by holding our own fossil fuel companies liable for their damages, we may be able to show as developed countries that we are taking historic responsibility and therefore bring other countries to the table in the Paris framework. Thanks.
All right, thank you to all of our speakers. So we kind of started with law and we moved through some science and economics and then policy at the end. And I want to ask some questions to get in more deeply in a lot of these issues and also bring Roberta and Rachel into the conversation as well. I'm going to start with a law-related question for Vic. We got a lot of lawyers in the room. We've got a lot of law students in the room, including many of my tort students, talking about some of these issues today in class right before we started this session. So for Vic, how are these current cases where you're representing state and local governments, how do they differ from, there's a lot of climate change cases over the last 2 decades or so that some people are familiar with. How are these are claims for damages against fossil fuel companies under state public nuisance, products liability theories, and also consumer protection theories. So how do these lawsuits differ from the ones in the past?
So I have actually 2 slides that encapsulate the answer to the question. So there are 3 primary differences between the state of play now and the state of play in the earlier cases. The first is science of causation. Now this is from a case called Native Village of Kivalina, which was decided by the Ninth Circuit. And one of the major differences between today and the past is that we can now, science allows us to draw very robustly the connections that we've discussed here between emissions and effects, and also between emissions of particular companies. So you can see how this is different. This is from the district court decision in that case. The plaintiff's allocations as to the undifferentiated nature of greenhouse gas emissions from all global sources and their worldwide accumulation, no realistic possibility of tracing. And there were a handful of other cases from this era where basically the plaintiffs themselves were saying there's a lot of emissions associated with this group of defendants, and it's got to be a substantial contribution to the problem. And the court said basically, no, you're dealing with so many different sources and so many different impacts that you can't do it. Second major difference is the legal theory that was used. So this is from the Supreme Court's decision in AEP versus Connecticut, where the plaintiffs sued under the federal common law of public nuisance. And they said, you know, emissions are an interstate pollution problem. And the relief that they sought in the case was for the courts to impose equitable emissions limitations on the defendants, who were largely power companies around the country. And what the court held is that as a matter of federal law, the relationship between the federal common law and federal statutory law, once Congress speaks to an issue, it displaces any common law that may have existed previously on the federal level. And they said, we have now the Clean Air Act, which addresses emissions, and therefore there is no federal common law. But significantly, and this was a unanimous decision, Justice Ginsburg added at the end of the decision of the opinion, the availability vel non, which I used to think meant something fancy, it just means or not, of a state lawsuit depends on the preemptive effect of the federal act. Now, this is very different from the displacement calculus, which is a matter of federal statutory law versus federal common law. When Congress acts with respect to state law, it has to intend to eliminate the state law remedy. That's a preemption analysis. It's a much higher bar. So the primary differences are which legal theory, and our legal theories are based on state law claims, not federal common law. Can we prove causation, and can we attribute that to the particular defendants? So those are the primary answers.
Thank you. All right, I want to ask a question to Roberta at this point. So you are the expert in the room in the Minnesota with regard to the Minnesota tobacco litigation. What parallels do you see between the Minnesota tobacco litigation of the 1990s and these climate change lawsuits that exist today?
Well, first, thanks for inviting me here today. I also spent 3 years in this room, but I was mostly hiding out in the back. And now that I'm sitting up here, I can see you guys back there. I didn't. I think the biggest parallel between the climate change litigation and the tobacco litigation was the necessity to turn to the courts after virtually every other institution and level of government in our society failed, and didn't fail just for a short period of time, but failed for year after year and decade after decade. I mean, you see it in the slides today, the knowledge going back to the 1960s. Yet here we are in 2019 facing the repercussions. And in tobacco, it was a similar pattern. The first really hard science linking smoking with cancer and other diseases came out in the early 1950s. And the tobacco companies denied that causal link and denied that tobacco was addiction for year after year, decade after decade. And there was actually 40 years of litigation against the tobacco industry, starting in the 1950s, before the state AGs brought suits in the 1990s and had success against the industry. I think that we're seeing the climate change litigation of the fossil fuel players using the same playbook in litigation as the tobacco companies did. And even in the Attorney General Ellison mentioned the discovery in the tobacco case, the truth coming out. We ended up getting 35 million pages of documents from the tobacco companies, many of which had been hidden for 4 decades. For the students in the room, the way you review 35 million pages of documents is 1 page at a time. So, and so they're following the same playbook, even using some of the same players, hiring payrolling researchers to create doubt about the science, using trade groups to do the same thing. But I think, in the end, the science is as solid as could be in tobacco. It's solid in climate change litigation, and the real battleground in both cases is really the causes of action and establishing your damages or other relief.
Thank you. One more question for Roberta, and then I want to move a little bit to back into the science and climate attribution. So can you talk a bit about the consumer protection laws in Minnesota for claims like these? The tobacco litigation was very much focused in on the consumer protection laws. Can you talk about the strength of the consumer protection statutes in Minnesota as compared to other states?
Yeah, so we spent about 5 years researching the case before we filed. It wasn't 5 years full time, but it was on and off for 5 years. And part of that was researching. We knew the battleground would be the causes of action because the 40 years of unsuccessful litigation had been individual smokers suing the tobacco industry. And the industry never lost a case, never paid one penny in damages, especially in these cases, is all-out warfare. And to give you a sense of what that's like in tobacco, just one company, Philip Morris, which is kind of the equivalent of ExxonMobil in climate change, had more than 30 law firms appearing in Minnesota. Well, the whole industry had more than 30 law firms. Philip Morris stood up in court one day and said they had 1,000 people working on the Minnesota case, and that they were spending in the pretrial proceedings before we ever got to trial $1.2 million a week on the Minnesota case. So that's kind of what you face when you bring these cases. So we knew we were in for a battle, and we knew that one of the big battle lines would be the causes of action. So we spent a lot of time researching what causes of action, because we would be representing the state of Minnesota and Cross to recover healthcare costs, as opposed to an individual smoker suing because of their personal injuries. And we did a 50-state search of the laws, and there was no state that had stronger consumer protection statutes than Minnesota. And that was part of the basis of our, kind of the heart of our case. We also had 2 antitrust claims under Minnesota law. And so the Minnesota consumer protection statutes are very powerful. They've been watered down some, unfortunately, by courts over the years. But there's a lot of parallels to be drawn with tobacco, but there's also differences. And so for any specific cause of action, you really have to dig hard into the facts and what applies in your case.
Thank you. Question now for Rachel. I mean, your area of work is more similar to Steve's than anyone else. So we hear the term climate attribution. And so where does science stand from your perspective with regard to the ability to tie the observed climate impacts to specific carbon producers? So can you elaborate a little bit on what Steve talked about, and also the work that the Union of Concerned Scientists has done in this regard?
My pleasure, and thanks again for having me up here. So yes, to build on what Steve had discussed, there has been a rapid increase in we call attribution science. So you may have heard, for example, when Hurricane Harvey happened, pretty much in real time, scientists are now able to look at the likelihood that those kinds of events would happen if not for human-caused climate change. But to sort of beyond that, in I believe one of your slides, you pointed to the 2014 Ricchetti study, which actually showed the amount of emissions historically that have been attributed to different large industrial carbon producers and cement manufacturers. And in 2017, the Union of Concerned Scientists published work that actually used those data and ran a simplified global climate model and was able to quantify the portion of global average surface temperature change and sea level rise to those specific industrial carbon producers and cement manufacturers. So we actually have those numbers. So for example, between 1880 and 2010, the emissions for the 90 largest industrial carbon producers, and again, we can get specific for different companies, but in total, 57% of the observed increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide during that time period is tied to those particular companies. 42 to 50% of the increase in global average surface temperature change is tied to those companies. 26 to 32% of sea level rise is tied to those companies. So we have in hand now those kinds of numbers. So now we're in the process at UCS of extending that work to ocean acidification, which certainly kind of broadens the scope of the kinds of communities that can see themselves in these kinds of numbers. And this research, certainly acknowledging the fact it's been conducted at the global scale. So now really we're starting to show, this is providing this type of research. These data are providing a framework for really creating the connection between emissions and impacts, not just at the global scale, but at the regional and local scale. So theoretically, we have these global climate models. Well, we also have regional climate models too. So we could, theoretically speaking, take these kinds of emissions data and run the regional climate models too to do this kind of work. So that's kind of the frontier of really where this is all headed, and could further solidify that connection that we are inching towards. And it's pretty clear at this point, as we've all been discussing, but we're just getting really more and more specific with the numbers.
Thank you, Rachel. And I should say, any of the students who've collected note cards, feel free to bring them down to me, and I'll try to ask as many questions from the audience as I can at the end. Question for Steve now. So you're an applied economist. Some of the lawyers and law students in the room know what that is. Many probably do not. Talk about how your area of expertise is relevant to these lawsuits. Usually you're not sitting on panels with lawyers. or even in the law school, as you said.
Right. Right. So I like to joke that we have a Department of Applied Economics. And we also have a Department of Economics, which I guess means we have a Department of Unapplied Economics. I'm not sure, but the point here is that, in my mind, actually, the economics is really integrated with the policy that Gabe talked about, the law, and the science. So I actually, my work in environmental economics, it's kind of the branch of economics that I do, really thinks about, how are we doing things that are changing or having impacts on the world? And then how does that come back to affect us? What are those costs and the benefits? And sometimes that's, you don't necessarily have to put this in dollar terms. Obviously, if you're talking about a damage suit, you are, but you can talk about what are the health impacts, what's the increase in severity of the storms. And then that ties here, obviously, to, as Jay was talking about, it's another step then to go from the severity of the storms to what are the damages associated with that. But to me, applied economics is really getting out and sort of bringing, in a way, demystifying economics to bring it into the discussion of many of these important policy issues and with connections to what is going on here in the law school.
Thank you. Question for Gabe. You talked about sort of different policy choices and where lawsuits and some of these supply side restrictions might fit. And you talked about that generally. Can you bring it down a little bit to Minnesota? So where does a lawsuit like this fit with all the forward-looking policies on climate here in Minnesota? We know Governor Walz just signed on to California's zero-emission vehicle mandate. We have a very strong renewable portfolio standard in the electricity sector. Attorney General Ellison talked about other things that the state of Minnesota is doing with regard to climate. And so you mentioned sort of the wonks in the room typically would say, well, we should be putting our climate efforts, our time, our money, and brain power in those areas rather than in litigation. So if we bring it down to a Minnesota level, how does that play out? Can you sort of apply your broader concept here in Minnesota?
Yeah, I think one of the things I raised at the end is the politics of this, and I think that one of the questions that I have is, where's the political energy coming from in all of this? And I think that there's a lot to say that there's a lot of political energy around fossil fuel infrastructure in the state with Line 3. I think that's a major galvanizing force in the state, and Enbridge is a major lobbying force in the state. And so I think that that's one place I would look for connections, is to say, how are future voters in this state going to really be made to feel like they have agency in this? And I could see that fossil fuel liability could be one place where that happens. And I think that, as you mentioned, we have a lot of climate policies already in formulation in the state. And I think just like with tobacco, it wasn't just the liability lawsuits that led to public smoking decreasing. It was a lot of combination of tools. It was banning public smoking. It was smoking around schools. It was information campaigns. It was a combination of state and federal action. And I think similarly, we'll see something like that with climate, with a lot of these policies working in concert, both on the supply and the demand side.
Thank you. Question for Jay. Mostly what we hear sort of nationally on climate impacts is coastal states, right? We're not Florida, we're not Maryland, we're not California. You detailed some of the harms, but can you talk magnitude-wise? I mean, should we be as concerned here? You do see people who say, hey, we're getting warmer winters in Minnesota, that there's a benefit.
Minnesotans should be very concerned. And it is because our climate is changing more than any other lower 48 states. And our whole sense of being is tied to natural resources for most Minnesotans, whether it's lakes, whether it's walleyes or other fish, whether it's bears or loons, which are endangered in Minnesota. We have control to some extent over our own surroundings. And I think part of that control has to be reaching out to what I think of as this fire that's now going on with climate change. It's like it's been lit on fire. And by it lit, the more fossil fuels are being burned now than ever before. just in New York Times yesterday was the new map that was created in New York about auto emissions around the country. And the reason why Governor Walz was really incented to take action on the lower emissions vehicles and zero emissions vehicles is that transportation emissions have gone up in Minnesota cars by 60% in 70 years. So, and some defined number of conspirators in this have been the fossil fuel industries. And they are all the time telling us that we need to burn more of their product and to disregard the problems of climate change. And we need to both push back as activists, but also push on those conspirators who have set the fires more robust than they've ever been. So we have to do this for our own well-being, but also maybe because there are now some people threatening in other parts of the country, and even for our years here in Minnesota, that Minnesota may be one of those refuges that people come to migrate to. But I want to clarify that very strongly in your mind, because I've been doing this now for almost 25 years. And I've been going all over the state talking to people about climate change. And there are still a few Minnesotans out there who are sure that they're going to deal with the accelerated climate change by spending more time at their lake, retiring to their lake place. And I want to inform you about that matter. Your lake will not be cool and comfortable. It will be choked with algae. It will not have loons. And it will be a time after the extreme hot days have taken over Minnesota. So you will see things that mean to most people, woe on earth.
All right. I'm now going to move to audience questions. There were lots of great audience questions. I will not be able to ask all of them. This one, I think, is mostly directed towards Vic, but others can chime in as well. So how do you deal with arguments that all people are using the products of fossil fuel companies, and therefore we're really all responsible for them?
Yeah, you hear this a lot from the industry, and their narrative on this is getting a lot stronger. I think the short answer is that the origin story of this climate crisis today is rooted in the deception campaign that I was describing for you. One of the most sobering facts that I have learned is that, remember 1988, I said that this was a fork in the road year? Half of all of the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in history, have occurred since that year. More than 3/4 since the 1960s. And the annual rate of emissions has gone up since 1990 by more than 63%. So we're dealing with a near-term past problem dating back to the mid-60s, about which these companies had knowledge, and they embarked on a campaign to avoid the consequences of it that was based on lies and deception. Imagine how the world would have been different if in 1988, instead of seeking to deny and delay and obfuscate, these companies had done what we require of every other manufacturer of products who has knowledge that their products pose risks to people and the world, which is to warn, is to stand up and give a clear warning commensurate with the risk. And they didn't. People need energy. There's no issue about that. Do they need fossil fuels? No.
Thanks. This question from the audience is specifically directed at Gabe. So The question is, do you think we should provide economic support to industries with lock-in problems so that they can walk away from the use of that locked-in infrastructure, or can regulation address this issue, or both?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. It's also one that gets right to the politics of this, and I think that the climate doesn't care about who's benefiting or losing, but we do, and our ability to address this problem fundamentally depends on that. So I think absolutely, we're in a political system. We're designing public policy. Energy is so deeply intertwined with so many of our lives, but energy production and generation of energy is fundamental for many communities. And it's not just the jobs, it's also the tax revenue, which is extremely important. And so I think as we think about designing policies, this notion of a just transition is really important. It's important just from a climate perspective of, can we get these policies passed, and who do we need to bring on board to do so? And I think it's also important that we do think about energy justice as we think about transforming climate. And there are many aspects to that. There are the workers, there's the industry, there's the tax base I mentioned. There's also the really high energy burden that a lot of people, including in Minnesota in particular, face in a really significant way. The fraction of your income that you spend on energy is above 10% if you're at or below the federal poverty line. And that's already really high. And as we think about, for example, paying down old coal debt and replacing that with something else, well, who's going to bear that cost? The people already paying more than 10% of their income on energy? Or are we going to think about also addressing equity as we think about transforming the energy system?
Thanks. So this question is not directed at any particular speaker, but I actually am going to ask Roberta the question because I think she may know something about it. So the question is, how do we combat politicization and misinformation campaigns, particularly given that the impacts here may not seem as direct to some members of the public, to the average person, as in the tobacco cases?
Yeah, well, one reason why I love litigation so much is because you can more effectively screen out the outside noise when you get into a courtroom. And in a big case that takes years to litigate, you've got a judge, hopefully, who's with you for the long haul. And over time, the court becomes more educated in the issues, figures out which lawyers he or she can trust and which not to trust. And then, by the time you get to the jury, juries are usually really good about following the instructions and listening to the evidence and evaluating the case based on what happens in the courtroom itself. And, in addition to that, one of the reasons why we love discovery so much is that you can kind of neutralize the political debate, because instead of asking the judge or the jury to believe what you're telling them, you're asking them to believe what the defendant's own documents, which were written at a time when they didn't think the outside world would see them. You're asking them to believe the defendants, what they were saying in private. And so it doesn't become a he said, she said kind of battle. It's just believe them, believe their own words that were written right here.
Thanks. This question asks, if fossil fuel companies are successfully prosecuted, does this open the door to liability for other emitters like farmers?
No.
What about electric utilities?
And if not, why? Why are we limiting it to fossil fuel companies?
Because if you look at this not as an issue of who's doing the emitting, but rather who is driving the use of energy and the promotion of their products, it's the fossil fuel companies. It's not the users. We were in a southeastern coastal state recently, talking with the mayor of a town there that's facing just horrific sea level rise, inundation. And in the course of the conversation, the mayor said, would it help or hurt the case that I'm a former mobile distributor and that my grandfather formed the local Petroleum Marketers Association when he was working for Shell? And I said, well, did you know what was what was the result of the use of the products that you were distributing? He said, no. And he said, in fact, my grandfather's purpose in forming the Petroleum Marketers Association was that We didn't trust the big oil company sons of bitches.
We are at 5 o'clock, but I want to make sure that if any of the speakers, based on what they've heard, have any last words, thoughts, that you have a chance to weigh in. No? So we will leave it at that, and I want everyone to thank our speakers.